50 Comanche warriors surrounded Caleb Thornfield's ranch at dawn, their war paint still wet horses pawing the earth, eyes set on the barn where he'd hidden the dying girl just 3 hours earlier. If he made a move now, he'd be dead before his second breath. But he'd made a choice the night before, a choice that couldn't be undone. This wasn't about land, or cattle, or grudges. This was about a girl who wasn't supposed to survive, and the white man who saved her anyway. It started with gunfire, not far from Willow Creek, where Caleb had gone to check his cattle. The shots echoed like thunder across the plains, short, sharp, frantic. Not the kind that start fights, the kind that end them. He should have turned back. That's what smart men did in Texas Territory, 1876. Let the dying stay buried. Let the Comanche and the cavalry handle their own hatred. But Caleb Thornfield hadn't been called a smart man in years. Not since Sarah died. He found the girl crumpled in the dust behind a fallen cottonwood. A bullet had chewed into her shoulder blade, soaking the buckskin dress she wore like armor. 16 at most. Eyes like black stone, not afraid, not pleading, just daring him to come closer. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had burned Caleb's neighbor's farm to the ground. Sarah never made it out. Caleb buried her with the same hands that built their ranch, then filled that grave with every ounce of trust he had left in the world. Since then, he kept to himself. No visitors, no mercy, just land cattle and silence. And yet here he was, dismounting, reaching for the girl with empty hands. She tried to crawl away, her mouth firing Comanche words like bullets, but her strength was gone. Caleb saw it, she'd be dead within the hour. And for some reason he still can't explain that mattered. He carried her home, through the dark, through the guilt, through the ghosts. She bled on his shirt, never cried, never begged, not once. Now, as the sun rises red and angry behind the warriors at his gate, Caleb stands behind the barn, slats watching death tighten around him. In the hay behind him, the girl Ayanna burns with fever. She whispers one word through cracked lips, "Father." And in the clearing beyond the fence, the war chief raises his hand. The creek was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb Thornfield had ridden out just after sunrise, saddle creaking beneath him, rifle slung across his back boots, damp with morning dew. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a handful of strays that had wandered from the herd overnight. Willow Creek was usually where they drifted. What he found instead was blood, spattered across the rocks like spilled ink. He pulled up his horse and scanned the cottonwoods. That's when he saw her, lying half hidden in the shadows, buckskin dress torn, a bullet buried deep in her shoulder. She was young, 16, 17 maybe, but already carved by the frontier. Her skin was dusted with grit, her lips split and dry. But her eyes still burned. Dark, fierce, not afraid, defiant. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. The old reflex flared, burned into his bones the night Sarah died. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had torched his neighbor's barn, and Sarah, sweet, stubborn Sarah, had been inside when the fire took everything. Since then, he'd lived on the edge of hate. Not enough to ride with the posies, but too much to forgive. The smart thing would have been to turn around. Leave her for the coyotes and the sun, but her eyes held something Sarah's used to hold. That refusal to beg, that silent dare. The girl tried to crawl away, dragging herself through the dirt. Blood soaked the ground behind her. She spat words in Comanche, sharp, fast, angry. Caleb didn't understand them, but he understood their meaning clear enough. "Stay back." He dismounted slow, hands visible. Step by step, like walking into a storm he knew was coming. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, even though he wasn't sure that was true. Her breathing was ragged. Her arms gave out. She collapsed. Caleb hesitated. His boots hovered over the line between justice and mercy. Then he remembered the promise he made at Sarah's grave. Don't let hate finish what grief started. He scooped the girl into his arms. She weighed nothing, less than a sack of feed, bones and blood and sheer will. By the time he reached his ranch, the sky was bleeding orange. He laid her in the barn on fresh hay and lit the fire for what would be the most desperate surgery of his life. The bullet had to come out, now. He held the blade to the flame, rolled up his sleeves. Behind him she stirred, her eyes opened. And for the first time Caleb saw not a Comanche, not an enemy, not even a girl. He saw someone who'd been left behind, just like him. The blade hissed as it kissed the flame. Caleb sat on an overturned crate, hands trembling not from fear, but memory. The barn smelled of old hay, horse sweat, and gun oil. But to him, it still carried the scent of Sarah. She'd helped him build this place with bare hands and stubborn love. This was where they'd slept the first winter when the cabin was just timber and promise. Now it was a field hospital, and his patient was the daughter of the people who'd set that promise on fire. The girl Ayanna, he'd soon learn, lay still on a blanket of hay, skin clammy, breath shallow. The bullet had torn through muscle-missed bone by inches, but infection was already stalking her. He didn't have time to think, only act. He slid a strip of leather between her teeth. "Bite," he whispered, not knowing if she understood. Her eyes fluttered open, storm-dark and glassy, but she nodded. The knife bit deeper than the bullet ever had. She arched off the hay body, stiff with pain, but she didn't scream, not once. Caleb dug, hands soaked in blood sweat, stinging his eyes. He'd pulled lead from cattle before, not people, not children, not enemies. Minutes passed like years. Then metal clinked against steel. The fragment came free. He tossed it into the dirt, just a hunk of death. The girl collapsed back, breathing ragged, passed out cold. Caleb bound the wound with boiled cloth and whispered prayers. Then he sat beside her in silence. The wind picked up outside. It howled through the rafters like Sarah used to laugh. "You'd hate this," he muttered. "Helping a Comanche girl, risking his life for a stranger with the same blood as your killers." But deep down, he knew she wouldn't hate it. She'd be the first to stitch her up. That thought broke him. He leaned forward, hands in his hair, choking on memories he thought he'd buried. Outside, coyotes cried to the moon. Inside, Caleb Thornfield wept. He wasn't weeping for the girl. He was weeping for the man he'd stopped being, and the man he might become again. The barn groaned with old wood. The fire crackled. And in the corner, Ayanna stirred. She mumbled something. A name. "Father." Then silence again. But Caleb had heard enough. He stood, walked to the door, opened it, and froze. In the dark horizon, flickering like stars across the prairie torchlight. Moving, surrounding. War paint glinting in the firelight. They'd found her, and they weren't here to talk. The drums began just before sunrise, low, distant, steady as a heartbeat, deadly as a promise. Caleb Thornfield stood at the barn doors, rifle cradled in one hand, heart in the other. In the fading dark, 50 Comanche riders formed a perfect circle around his ranch. Silent, still. Their horses snorted steam into the morning cold hooves, stamping impatient for blood. The war chief sat tall atop a painted stallion. His braids were streaked with gray. His chest marked with scars that told stories no man lived to repeat. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Ayanna was behind Caleb, curled under blankets. Fever rising again. Her skin was fire to the touch, but her eyes had opened hours ago, watching him, studying him. Not with fear, Not anymore. With something else. Recognition. Outside, the chief raised one hand. The circle tightened. Caleb counted weapons, rifles, bows, tomahawks. He counted his own 1 Winchester, 2 Colt pistols, 30 rounds of ammunition, and a dead man's courage. He wouldn't last 5 minutes. Running wasn't an option. The girl couldn't be moved. Her wound would tear open. She'd bleed out in the saddle. And even if they fled, there was nowhere to go. No cover. No mercy. Then the chief called out, "White man, you have what belongs to us." His voice rolled across the field like thunder. Caleb's mouth went dry. He stepped forward, just enough to be seen, hands empty, rifle slung. "She's alive," he called back. "Your daughter is alive. But she's hurt bad." The warriors tensed. Bows creaked. The chief's jaw tightened. "You lie," he growled. "Show her to us." Caleb hesitated. He thought of the blood, the crude stitching, the tremble in her limbs. If they saw her like that, they'd assume torture, not medicine. Behind him, Ayanna shifted. Then, soft as wind, her voice came. "Father." She tried to rise, failed, tried again. Caleb turned to help, but 20 arrows instantly tracked his chest. "Don't," the chief warned. "Don't touch her again." 2 Comanche women dismounted, moved to Ayanna like smoke. They examined the bandages, the fever, the work, and something changed in their eyes. One nodded. Slow, measured. She was treated, one said, in Comanche, not harmed. But the chief's lieutenant, a younger warrior face carved with hate, rode forward. "You take her," he hissed in broken English. "You die." It wasn't justice. It wasn't grief. It was war waiting for permission. And Caleb knew the fight wasn't over Ayanna. It was over fire, land, old blood. But she could still stop it, if she spoke, if they believed her. She struggled to her feet, swaying. Her lips moved. 3 words. In Comanche. The war chief's eyes widened. The lieutenant went pale, and the wind stopped moving. Ayanna swayed in the barn doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other pressed against her wound. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Her face was pale with fever, streaked with dust and pain. But her eyes, they held. Fierce, focused. The war chief stared. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Neither did his warriors. 50 bows held in midair. 50 warriors frozen at the edge of vengeance. Ayanna lifted her chin. Blood trickled from her lips. She spoke. 3 words. In Comanche. The effect was immediate. The chief's face went blank, then cracked, not with anger, but something older. Grief, recognition. The lieutenant beside him shifted in his saddle. His jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. Ayanna's voice rose again, louder, hoarser. She was pointing. At the young warrior, her father's second in command. Caleb couldn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. The chief did. His shoulders stiffened. His hand drifted toward the tomahawk at his belt. The lieutenant barked back in Comanche, rapid, defensive, desperate. Then in English, for Caleb's benefit, she lies. Fever has broken her mind. She is confused. But his voice cracked, and no one missed it. Ayanna said more, short, sharp, final. The chief's expression turned to stone. He dismounted in silence, stepped forward, and stared into the face of his daughter. "What did she say?" Caleb whispered to one of the women nearby. The older Comanche woman answered without looking away. She said he led her into the ambush, told her to take that trail, sold her to the cavalry. The trader's face went pale. "I fought beside you," he shouted. "You will believe her over me." The chief said nothing, but his eyes had already made their decision. The lieutenant's hand dropped to his knife. Not slowly, not cautiously, desperate. Ayanna didn't flinch. Caleb didn't wait. He moved like instinct, crossed the barnyard in a heartbeat, and tackled the young warrior off his horse. They hit the dirt hard. Dust rose, bows snapped toward the scuffle. The fight was ugly, close, brutal. A knife flashed. Caleb felt it slice his ribs. He didn't care. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They rolled, grappled. Caleb's hand found a rock. He swung. Once, the traitor collapsed beside him out cold. Silence fell like a curtain. Then the chief stepped forward. He pulled his tomahawk but didn't raise it toward Caleb. He stood over the unconscious lieutenant, looked at the blood, the betrayal, then spoke to his warriors. They nodded. 2 of them dragged the traitor away. Not to kill him, to judge him. The chief turned back to Caleb, looked him in the eyes. "You fight for my daughter," he said. "I'd do it again," Caleb replied, his voice hoarse. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when the first rifle cracked from above. Wood shattered inches from Caleb's head. He ducked instinctively, heart hammering. Another shot rang out closer, sharper. Then came the shouting. Men in blue, cavalry, 20 of them riding hard down the slope, rifles raised, and leading them Patterson, the same officer who'd once asked Caleb for maps, the same man who smiled too easily when talking about peace through strength. Caleb saw it all in a flash. This wasn't rescue. This was a setup. Ayanna wasn't just a wounded girl anymore, she was bait. And her father's war party gathered peacefully on Caleb's land. They were the trap. The lieutenant's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had feared. He hadn't just sold Ayanna's trail. He'd timed it, engineered it. This ambush had been planned before Ayanna ever bled into Caleb's hands. A bullet struck the barn. Horses screamed. Comanche warriors scattered, diving for cover behind barrels, fences, and troughs. The war chief moved like a ghost, grabbing Ayanna, pulling her behind a wooden stock tank, just as splinters exploded from its side. "She can't run," Caleb shouted, crawling across the yard with his rifle. "She'll bleed out." The chief didn't answer, but his eyes burned with understanding and fury. This wasn't war, this was slaughter. And they all knew who started it. Behind the water trough, Ayanna's fevered gaze sharpened. She pointed toward the unconscious lieutenant now stirring in the dust. He was crawling, reaching for a dropped rifle. Ayanna's lips moved. Her voice cracked like dry paper. "He's not done." Caleb turned, too far to shoot. The lieutenant's hand wrapped around the rifle. He rolled onto his side, aiming not at Caleb, but at Ayanna. Everything slowed. Caleb shouted, but the bullet never came, because one of the Comanche warriors, young, silent, steady, had raised his bow. The arrow struck true, straight through the traitor's chest. He dropped without a sound, justice without a trial. The chief stood slowly, looked at the boy who fired, nodded once, then turned toward the ridge. More cavalry were coming, reinforcements, dust clouds rising behind the hills. The trap had been meant to end here with a massacre. But the traitor's name was known now. His blood had stained the truth into the dirt. And what came next would be a different kind of reckoning. The sky cracked open with gunfire. The cavalry thundered down the ridge like a wave of iron and smoke uniforms, flaring in the wind, rifles barking vengeance with every shot. Caleb barely made it to the cabin before the next volley hit. Bullets shattered the windows, chewed through the porch rail, and punched holes in the walls like angry fists. Inside, dust danced in the beams of rising sun. He dropped to the floor chest, heaving hands fumbling for cartridges. His Winchester was nearly empty. Across the yard, the Comanche fought like men born into battle. No panic. No wasted movement. They used what little cover the ranch offered: hay bales, troughs, even splintered fence posts, turning Caleb's home into a battlefield. Ayanna was hidden behind the water tank. The chief crouched beside her. His face was set like stone. Not rage, not fear, just acceptance. They all knew the odds. Caleb's rifle cracked. One cavalryman dropped. Another dove behind a wagon. And still they came. The cavalry officer Patterson stood tall on his horse, barking orders like the war was already won. Thornfield, he shouted between shots. "Step away from the hostiles. We're here to rescue you. Rescue!" Caleb nearly laughed. He loaded his last round, aimed, and fired. The bullet knocked Patterson's hat clean off his head. "I'll pick my own damn side," Caleb roared. That was the moment everything turned. The Comanche warriors, watching from behind the barn, saw it. The white man wasn't just sheltering the chief's daughter. He was standing with them. For them. A moment of stillness, then the war chief barked a single command. Half his warriors surged forward, flanking the cavalry on the east. Arrows rained from the ridge. Another bullet grazed Caleb's shoulder. He staggered, caught himself on the cabin door frame, teeth clenched against the pain. His porch was on fire. His barn was half destroyed. But he didn't retreat. He didn't surrender, because Ayanna was still breathing. And for the first time since Sarah died, Caleb had something worth bleeding for. Then hoofbeats, from the south. Not Comanche, not cavalry, ranchers. Pete Murdoch rode in first, shotgun raised, 6 more men at his back. "What in hell is going on?" he shouted. Pete saw Caleb, saw the Comanche, saw the blood, and didn't hesitate. He turned his shotgun toward the ridge. "Guess we're on your side, Thornfield." Smoke curled from the porch as flames chewed through the railing. The barn was scorched. The trough splintered. Blood soaked the dust between scattered hoofprints. And Caleb Thornfield, wounded, grim eyes sharp with purpose, stood in the middle of it all. Rifle raised. Not at the Comanche, but at the blue coats riding under his own flag. Across the yard, Pete Murdoch and the other ranchers dismounted, fanning out. They didn't need instructions. They saw the chaos, saw the Comanche warriors fighting to protect a wounded girl, saw Caleb covered in blood, not from killing, but from healing. One of Pete's men shouted toward the ridge, "Hold your fire, civilians down there." The cavalry didn't stop. Orders still rang from the hillside. Patterson, bleeding from the ear hair, matted with dust, was shouting something about treason. He reached for his sidearm. A mistake. The war chief saw it. Before the pistol cleared leather, the chief's tomahawk spun through the air like thunder. It struck true. The commander dropped. Silence followed, like the land itself exhaled. The remaining soldiers froze. Not because of fear, but clarity. They were outnumbered, outgunned. And the man they were supposed to rescue had just stood shoulder to shoulder with the enemy. A soldier dropped his rifle. Another raised his hands. Then another. And then it was done. Just like that. No bugle, no surrender. Just men who didn't want to die for the wrong story. Caleb lowered his weapon. His shoulder throbbed. Smoke stung his eyes, but he was still standing. The chief approached slowly, tomahawk now sheathed again at his side. "You fought beside us," he said. "I fought for what was right," Caleb answered. They stood there, surrounded by broken fences, burning beams, and bodies cooling in the dust. And yet, for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb felt no weight on his chest. No emptiness. Only breath. Ayanna was sitting up now, propped against a hay bale. Fever broken, eyes clearer. She watched Caleb and her father with something like awe. The ranchers gathered around. Pete gave Caleb a nod. "We knew you were a decent man. But this is something else." Caleb didn't speak. Didn't have to. Because every man in that circle understood. Something bigger than survival had just happened here. A line had been crossed. Not in blood, but in understanding. The tomahawk landed with a sickening thud. Not in war, not in rage, but in judgment. Colonel Patterson's body crumpled in the dust, one hand still wrapped around the pistol he'd tried to draw on a rancher. The cavalrymen who remained didn't move, didn't reach for their weapons. They'd seen enough death for one morning. Caleb didn't blink. He'd watched men die before watched worse. But this was different. This was justice. And justice didn't always wear brass buttons or carry papers stamped with seals. Sometimes it came carved from ashwood wrapped in sinew and carried by a man whose daughter had bled behind a white man's barn. The war chief stood tall, blood speckled on his braids. He said nothing as he retrieved his weapon, just looked down at the body of a commander who had come for peace wearing the mask of conquest. Then he turned to his men, to the ranchers, to Caleb. His eyes were tired, but steady. "This ends here," he said. "No more arrows, no more bullets. Let fire die now." Pete Murdoch nodded. "We'll back your word, and Thornfield's." The chief looked at Caleb. "You carry her blood now." He meant Ayanna, not in bloodline, but in bond. Ayanna, still weak, stood with help from one of the women. She walked slow, shaking to her father, said something soft in Comanche. The chief looked at her, then at Caleb. Then, to everyone's surprise, he reached into his belt and pulled a small pouch, woven with beads, etched with symbols older than the state of Texas. He handed it to Caleb. "This protects," he said, "until your bones return to earth." Caleb took it. No words, just a slow nod. The ranchers watched silent. The cavalry sat disarmed in the dirt, hands raised, their rifles scattered. Smoke still rose from the barn. The porch still burned low. But something deeper had been put out, not fire. Hatred. And still Caleb felt it wasn't over. The price had been paid, but the land had memory. Ayanna turned toward him. Her eyes, once defiant, were now something else. Steady, knowing. "You fought for me," she said, voice hoarse but clear. "Now I stay. Until healed." The chief hesitated, but didn't argue. "Then you guard her," he told Caleb. "And if she dies, I die too," Caleb said simply. The wind moved, the dust settled, and behind the distant hills, new riders approached. Not Comanche, not cavalry, but something else entirely. 2 weeks passed. The barn was still half burned, the porch rebuilt with uneven boards and bullet holes still pocked the siding like ghosts that refused to leave. But inside the cabin, something else was mending. Ayanna sat at the table, a blanket over her shoulders, a half-healed wound beneath her dress, and a pencil clutched in her fingers like a weapon she hadn't learned how to wield yet. "A-L-E-B, she said slowly. Caleb smiled faintly. "That's right." He pointed to himself, then to where? "Ayanna." She nodded, then added something in Comanche. A word. Short, deliberate. He paused. "What's that mean?" She touched her chest, then the table, then him, between. Her voice was quiet, not fragile, focused. The word hung in the air, like the smoke of something just extinguished. They sat like that for hours some days, trading sounds, scribbles, stories. He taught her how to read English. She taught him how to listen with his eyes. Some words couldn't be written, but they could still be felt. In the way she held his gaze, in the way he refilled her tea before she asked, in the way silence no longer meant fear. Outside, the town whispered. Some said he was protecting a savage. Others said he'd lost his mind. But just a few came by with bread or blankets or questions they didn't quite know how to ask. Ayanna always greeted them with a nod. She never smiled. Not yet. But she was watching. Caleb caught her once staring at the sky, lips moving soundlessly. Praying, he asked. She shook her head, remembering. He didn't ask what. He knew what memories felt like, heavy, sharp, silent. Later that night, she handed him a page, words scrawled in broken English. To fight is easy. To forgive is hard. You teach me both. Caleb folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket. That same coat still bore Sarah's bloodstain on the inside lining. He didn't plan to wash it. Not now. Not ever. Because it no longer meant pain. It meant history. It meant crossing over. It meant something had been built between two broken people, something stronger than war. 30 years later, they still talk about the white man who protected the enemy's daughter and the land that never forgot it. The wind still moved the same across Thornfield Ranch, dry low. Humming like a memory stuck between two worlds. The porch had been rebuilt 3 times. The barn now stood stronger than ever. But the bullet holes on the cabin door were never patched. Caleb left them there. Like scars, like truth. He never remarried, never left the land, but he was never alone again. Ayanna returned each spring riding at the head of her band, no longer a daughter hidden behind war paint, but a woman who carried peace in her voice and law in her hands. She wore her scars proudly and carried documents now instead of weapons. Treaties, translations, truth. She could read every clause, every line, because Caleb taught her to. And Caleb, he became something no one expected. Not a legend, not a hero, a bridge. White settlers came to him when crops were burned. Comanche came when water rights were threatened. He spoke little, listened much. His ranch became a meeting place. No flags, no fences, just land. And 2 chairs beneath a cottonwood where enemies once aimed rifles and now shared tobacco. When he died 30 years to the day after that morning of war, they buried him under the same tree where Ayanna had once whispered father through cracked lips. The medicine bag still hung from his belt, unopened, untouched. Ayanna spoke at his funeral, in English and Comanche. This land took his wife, took his trust, but it did not take his soul.